Dear Impulse, it is awesome to be able to share with you guys for another week. I hope you are embracing that summer is finally here. You're done with online learning for a season, well, hopefully long term. But I hope you guys are embracing all things summer. Maybe you've already gotten out and gone swimming or been able to be outside more, maybe a bike ride or something like that. Or maybe some of you guys have been catching up on some TV shows or other things throughout the year that you might have missed. And I know for me, my family was all about the documentary on Michael Jordan called The Last Dance. I don't know how many of you guys tuned in or have heard about it, but it was really fun. Even though I didn't watch all the episodes myself, whenever my family was together, they were always debating things about that documentary. And of course, the question of who is the greatest basketball player of all time kept coming up in discussion. Now, my husband is a diehard LeBron fan, and so he loves to have that debate with people. Is it MJ? Is it LeBron? Is it Kobe? Is it somebody else? And it always was a fun discussion to have because they could debate different things. Does this championship mean more than this one? And all the different dissecting of the players' abilities and skill sets. And so that documentary really brought to the forefront that whole conversation once again of who is the GOAT. And that's not the only time we have that kind of discussion, right? We love to debate what is the greatest in any category, right? What's the greatest movie of all time? Who's the best singer of all time? Who's the best guitar player of all time? What's the best flavor of ice cream? We love to have conversations about what is the greatest of all time. And so it's no surprise that that kind of conversation even finds its way into the Bible. There's a conversation that we're going to look at over the next couple weeks where Jesus is talking to a religious leader and gets asked, what is the greatest commandment of all time? And so we're going to actually dive into this story today, and I'm super excited. It's a short passage, but there's a lot of really great stuff in there. So if you have your Bibles with you or you have your smartphone, I want you guys to turn to Matthew. So it's the first book in the New Testament, Matthew chapter 22. And we're going to actually start in verse 34. So I'll give you guys a second to get there. Matthew was one of the disciples of Jesus. And so he's recording this encounter between Jesus and a religious leader. Now we know from context, religious leaders often meant they were Pharisees. That's kind of the fancier term. But really what that meant was this was someone who was a religious leader in the community, and they loved to study the Bible. Now, the Bible looked different for them in those days because the New Testament hadn't been written yet. And so for them, it was really mainly the first 5 books of the Bible that we know today. So it was Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And those were the ones that they studied and they knew forwards and backwards. And so this guy was coming to the table, coming to this conversation, having studied the law for most of his life. He would have known the law forwards and backwards when he asked Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? And so again, follow along here, Matthew chapter 22, starting in verse 34. It says, hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, which is another kind of religious leader group, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question, Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. Now we read that passage, and to you and I, that might not sound strange, right? Love God, love others. Those are things that we know and we spend a lot of time talking about. But Jesus' answer was radical in those days. Now, we don't fully understand this, but for an expert of the law, a guy who spent his life studying the law, he would have known that in the law in the Old Testament, there are over 600 laws to study. And so if we were to rewind back in time, the people of Israel, God's chosen people, were taken out of slavery, out of Egypt, and they end up camping at the base of this mountain. And Moses goes up the mountain, and he spends multiple days up there, and God gives him the law. Now, we often just think of the 10 Commandments, but when Moses was up there, he got all of the law. So all 600 plus laws that covered everything from how to do a sacrifice, how to atone for different sins, what to eat, what not to eat, how to treat your neighbor, how to handle cleanliness in the community, how to set up God's tabernacle, the place of dwelling that God rested in during those days of wandering in the wilderness. They got rules for every aspect of life. And so for the Pharisees, for these religious leaders who studied the law, their life was about do's and don'ts. They were so concerned about following the letter of the law. And so they would do what seems like crazy things like, I can only take so many steps a day before I break the law, or I can only do this and I can't do that. And so it really became a system of just do's and don'ts, this list of things. And so the Pharisees, in their minds, they thought, as long as I follow this list of rules, I'm following God. And unfortunately, in that effort to follow a list of rules, they missed who God was, and they missed the whole point of the law, which was to help lead people into a deeper relationship with God. And Jesus knew that. Jesus knew the law. It's not a stranger to him, right? And yet he said, this is what the law is really about, to love God with all of your heart and soul and mind. And if you do that, if you make that your priority, your actions will reflect that. But it starts with what's happening on the inside. He was more concerned about the heart than just a bunch of actions following rules. Now, unfortunately, today I feel like Christians sometimes get a bad reputation, and people can often associate Christianity with just a bunch of rules, right? We can't do this. We shouldn't say that. We can't act this way. Or we have to go to church every week. We have to do this. We have to do that. And that's missing the whole point of following after Jesus, right? Jesus isn't interested in if we check off every box every single day, everything perfectly. Jesus wants our heart. He wants our mind. He wants our strength. He wants us to love him with everything we have. And if we do that, sure, these things might be present in our lives, how we treat people, how we act, what we say, what we do, what we think. But he starts with the heart. And so that's what Jesus was communicating to this Pharisee. And that's what he was communicating to us. It's important for us to follow things that we know we should be doing. I'm not saying to throw out the law and to never focus or never follow any rules. Rules are there to help us. But at the heart and at the end of the day, Jesus wants us to follow him the way that he sees us. And again, that starts with the heart. That's the most vital thing. Not what we just do and say and act, but how we really hold him inside. So throughout this next couple weeks, we're going to talk about the greatest commandments. We're going to talk, what does it actually mean then to follow Jesus with your heart, to follow Jesus with your soul, to follow Jesus with your mind, and how do we love our neighbor as ourselves? I think these are important questions to answer all the time, but especially in light of what's happening in our country and in our community, it's more important than ever to know what we believe as Christians and to follow God with everything we've got. I have a simple challenge for you guys as we lead into this series. And maybe some of you are in the habit of doing this, and maybe some of you have never done this before, and that's okay. I really want to challenge you guys to memorize the greatest commandment and the second greatest commandment. It's 4 verses in the Bible, Matthew chapter 22, verses 37 through 40. And I want you guys to memorize it. This is something that's so important to our faith. And there are certain verses, just like John 3:16 is important to know, these are also important to know and to have ready so that we know what we're called to do and to follow. And so I want to challenge you over these next couple weeks, make it a priority to memorize the greatest commandment. But not just memorize it for memorizing's sake, but to memorize it so that it's in our hearts and in our minds and in our thoughts throughout our day. We are praying for you guys. We're excited for you guys. We are expectant to hopefully be able to meet together here sometime over the summer. So stay tuned about when and where that's going to happen. We give updates on our Facebook page. And so we are excited for you guys, and we'll see you next week.